Welcome back to another episode of Live and Invest Abroad, the podcast where we explore the endless opportunities for living, investing, and thriving around the world. I'm your host, Vanessa Rosenblum, and today's guest is someone who embodies the spirit of adventure and financial freedom. Sarah Weaver is an author, a speaker, a real estate investor, a real estate coach, and a multiple time entrepreneur. She's built a thriving real estate portfolio while living fully nomadic and traveling all over the world. I met Sarah about 10 years ago when she worked for my real estate recruiting firm, Pro REA Staffing. She was 25 years old. She was just starting out in her career and she worked for me as a recruiter. While she worked for me, she lived and traveled and worked through Europe and Central and South America, saving up enough money to buy her first investment property. And we'll get into all of that and more in this podcast. The things I want you to listen for in this interview are first, just I want you to get some inspiration. Sarah has such a great story, and I think you can learn a lot from her. We're also going to talk about real estate strategy, how to use 30-day or midterm rentals to build a portfolio that cash flows, that doesn't require all of the hands-on work of short-term rentals. I'm excited to share this interview with you. Let's dig in. Sarah, it's so great to see you. Thank you so much for hopping on the podcast with me.
Absolutely. It's been such an honor to get your email. And it's just going to be so fun to see how far we've come from our very first Zoom interview. And it's just really cool to be catching up.
So, to catch our audience up, when I first met Sarah, I was running my recruiting firm, Pro REA Staffing, and I was looking for a recruiter. All of my recruiters work remotely. I was living in Boston at the time. Sarah, you were in Texas, I believe, right? I hired Sarah and you worked with me for 4 years. You were an incredible recruiter. And during that time, I moved to Europe. You moved all over the place, which we'll get into in a minute. And then the rest is history. So we'll get into all of that. Sarah, let's give the big picture of who you are and what you're doing today, and then we'll backpedal and talk about your origin story.
Yeah. So right now I am running a few small businesses and I serve real estate investors. So I help people all over the country invest in places that they don't live. And so my main focus is teaching. So I have a small community. There's about 60 students. We meet weekly. It's a year-long program. And for the most part, they have W-2s. A lot of them are married, and so they have decent salaries and they're trying to navigate, how do I create cash flow or passive income through real estate investing? Some of them have the goal of quitting their job. Most of them are attracted to working with me because I love travel and they want to travel more. And that really is the main focus of that community. And then because I serve real estate investors and I think I'm such an entrepreneur, I started recognizing some of the challenges that come along the way. One of the biggest ones is that I would convince them to own a furnished rental, which I know we'll talk about the midterm rental strategy, but I would convince them to own a furnished rental in a place that they don't live. And they would be like, okay, how do I furnish this? I don't want to take time off my job to go schlep furniture together in Florida or wherever the furnished rental is going to be.
Mhm.
So my company, Aria Design Services, we will analyze the property for you, figure out the best strategy for it, curate all of the furniture, handle all the delivery, and we'll even do all the installation. So we'll fly down and get it completely set up and ready. And then to my surprise, a lot of people came to me, Vanessa. They're like, "Hey, yeah, real estate's cool, but I already got that figured out. How do I travel like you?" And that was more or less how my third business, Invested Adventures, came about. And so now I own a small scale retreat company where I take real estate investors on epic adventures. We have hiked Kilimanjaro, been on an African safari. We're headed to Japan next month for a 10-day solely about food. So it's Invested Adventures Eats Japan, lots of hiking, drinking wine in the south of Italy, really focusing on how do we bring investors together and make a bucket list adventure a tax write off.
Ooh, I love that. Okay, so I want listeners to clue into a few things that we're going to talk about today. One, I wanted to talk to you, Sarah, because I think you're an inspiration. I think the way you got started and your single-mindedness and your focus that got you where you were when I met you to where you are now, I think is a journey that people should know about because they could find their own version of that. Two, I want people to really understand this midterm rental concept and this idea of managing property remotely, especially if you're in Europe or you're somewhere where you have to put down 30, 40% to buy a property, you might want to consider what it would look like to maybe buy a property in the United States. And I think a lot of people around the world, that is just such a foreign concept. So we'll talk about how that's even achievable, whether you're living in the US, you want to invest there, or you're anywhere in the world. These are models that can be replicated in lots of markets. You just have to run the numbers. So those are some of the things I want to get into. But let's talk about how you got started. So when we started working together, I said, I don't care where you are, you just need to show up during business hours. And that's how I always like to run my companies. And I find really motivated, driven individuals. So, how did you take the advantage of having a US salary and a remote job and use that to the best advantage possible?
Yeah, there were so many reasons that I wanted to work for Priority Staffing. You took like my two loves at the time, which was real estate and talking to people. And so I got to really like hone in on the skills that I had, and you let me work anywhere. And so this was back in, I started at the end of 2015. And so this was before, well before a ton of offices allowed work from home or even went fully remote. I joke that the pandemic like made my dating pool a lot larger because I want a partner that can work remote. But at the time, it wasn't very common to work remote. And so that was one of the things I loved about the job. So that very first year, believe I moved from Texas to Colorado. But before I did that, I did a 3-month stint in Colombia, South America. And I love that you alluded to it earlier. I had better internet than you did, and you're in Europe, and I was, like, on a finca, a coffee plantation in the middle of nowhere. Later, when I like, years later, I was in Brazil, and I'll never forget the best internet in this village that I lived in Brazil was, like, a beach bar. They had fiber optics laid to it, and so I quite literally was living, like, the digital nomad dream, no shoes, feet in the sand, talking to incredibly successful real estate professionals all over the country that you were serving through pro rata staffing. And that's what my life looked like. The reality is that I just wanted to own more rental properties. There had always been this like whisper of like owning real estate is a way to build wealth. We worked with a lot of real estate agents, and I'd love your opinion, but my view was there was a lot of rich agents, but I wanted to see what were the wealthy agents doing. So, like, my idea of rich versus wealthy, they were rich, they had nice clothes, they went on nice vacations. But if they didn't show up to work every single week and continue closing transaction after transaction, there was no way that they could afford their lifestyle. Whereas we also worked with some real estate agents that were also wealthy. And one thing I noticed is that they were buying like apartment buildings in Iowa. I would mention that I was in Kansas and they'd be like, "Oh yeah, I own an apartment building there." And I was like, "What?" And they were owning what I called like dinky duplexes in Missouri. And that's when I really started to realize that, okay, that is like my path to wealth.
And so at one point, you really went all in and just lived in hostels in Central and South America. And there were good parts of that, and there were struggles in there. So, talk about what
Yeah.
that part of your journey was like and what your motivation was for living down there basically full time.
Yeah, absolutely. While I was working for you, I was really bouncing between the US and Europe and South America and really living that digital nomad life. But fast forward to 2019 and I went fully nomadic. So I like gave up my apartment, which actually was the house that I owned. I filled it with tenants and I set off on a nomadic adventure. And you don't actually know this yet. So I'm excited to tell you on air, but I'm ending my nomadic life this month. It has been 6 years fully living out of a suitcase, most of the time a carry-on, and I am tired. It is amazing, and I loved it, and we'll talk about all of the great things, but the reality is that other parts of my life suffered. I just turned 35 this month, which is just wild. I'm like, "Wait, I'm not 30 anymore?" And there's things that I want that are different than 27-year-old Sarah when I really first started out this way. And I originally thought in 2019, I thought this would be a year. I would just do full nomad for 1 year. I like moved to Bali. I felt like a total digital nomad cliche. But then the pandemic changed things. And then I wrote a book. The book started doing really well. And so I've actually spent the last 2 years speaking at conferences. Last year, I spoke 37 events and I flew 85 times. And so I think at the end of 2024, I was like, okay, I am tired. I want to own a bed that I get to sleep in. I own 11 furnished rentals, but I don't sleep in any of them. And so it was time. And so that's actually my big news and kind of the big next chapter is what does life look like after being a nomad?
Congratulations. It has been quite a run, and I'm not surprised at some point you do want your own bed. So where is home going to be?
Yeah, never say never because I quite literally said I would never move back to Kansas City, but that just makes the most sense. I closed on a house about a month ago, took it completely down to the studs, and I have a group of about 16 friends, and 8 of us left. We left Kansas City. Most of them went on to do very impressive careers, doctors, lawyers, and just left. And 7 of the 8 have come back. And so I've seen what it's like to transition back to your hometown. And I just think it's time. And then, like you and I know, nothing's permanent. So really, I'm writing in my journal, just give it 18 months. If you hate it, you can leave.
You can always rent it out. It'll be fine.
Yeah,
Right.
exactly.
Good. That's amazing. One of my favorite stories that I like to tell about you is what happened during COVID. So you quit working for me and you moved to Asia, right? Is that how this
Yep.
goes, right? Talk
Yep.
about how you ended up in New Zealand and how you spent your time there. And then we'll talk about how that led to your property. You started buying property then.
Yeah. So I negotiated 9 weeks off in between working for you and working for the next entrepreneur. And so I was backpacking Southeast Asia and she actually called me, my new boss at the time called me and said, hey, I'm changing up our business plan for Q1, Q2. So you actually don't need to come back to the US. And that was really it. She was very short and I hung up. I'll never forget. I was in a hostel in Vietnam, like sitting along a river. And I just was like, oh my God. Oh my God. Like my life just changed because I had plans of settling back in Kansas City with really the eventual of moving back to Austin. It was somewhere that I lived when I first started working for you. And so I got that phone call and I just grabbed my journal and started writing like all the places I could go. What, did I want to stay in Vietnam? Did I want to live in Bali? Did I want to live in Australia? And I ended up in Bali and started working. It was, I think I actually started like January 5th for this new company. So it's just living the digital nomad dream of staying in cool beach clubs on the weekend and really cool co living and Airbnbs during the week. And then I was doing a visa run. So every 30 days, I had to leave Indonesia because of the visa that I had. And for those of you that are not familiar with this lifestyle, like there are hundreds, if not tens of thousands of people like me. Like when I show up at the hostel, there's 9 other Americans, a few Europeans. Like I am not special by any means. There's tons of people living their life like this. But if you're not familiar with this, that probably like this all sounds really wild. So I go to Singapore for the weekend, turn around, come back. And then the following month, I need to leave again. And so I go to Malaysia, I actually meet up with girls that I had met in my travels, because who doesn't have a casual girls' weekend in Malaysia? And I'm meeting up with them, and it was March and things in the US. Really, what I felt like finally started talking about this coronavirus, which we had been talking about and living with in Asia for almost 3.5 months at that point. I was wearing a mask on planes because everybody else was wearing a mask on the plane. It wasn't affecting our daily life, but it was something like people were talking about. On March 13th, when the US president closed the US borders, I was like, oh my God, this is going to change everything. And so I had a flight back to Bali my suitcase was there. I just had a backpack for the weekend, right? Like a weekender bag. And I just thought, my gut is telling me I shouldn't go back. I don't know that the Indonesian government can handle I was familiar with what happened when SARS hit. I was like, I don't know if Indonesia is where you want to be when like a true pandemic or epidemic breaks out. So I wrote in my journal, best places to be trapped in during a pandemic. And without getting political, this also was a time where Kim Jong Un and Donald Trump were like Twitter fighting. So I also was like, World War III is not that out of the question at this point. And on that very short list, it said New Zealand, Australia, Singapore. So I applied for visitor visas to all three countries. Within 12 hours, I had an email that I had my New Zealand and Australian visa. I think I spent maybe $70 each for those. And I was just sitting at the breakfast table, like, what do I do? And I'll never forget this Belgium guy was like, you should go to New Zealand. He's, I went there with my girlfriend. We got a van. It was cool. And I was like, I've always been into van life. Like I had a Pinterest board of all
I
these cute
remember he used to
campers.
send me the pictures. We talked about van life a lot back in the day.
Yeah. And it didn't make sense in the US. Like I say that my habits don't really align with van life. I'm not like an epic rock climber or a cool mountain biker like your son. And so I was like van life in the US is pretty uncomfortable because it's such a big country. You have to drive so far. You need to like really be into those habits and hobbies. And so in New Zealand, it just made it's a tiny country. Like cool waterfall is 30 minutes from cool beach, 30 minutes to cool mountains. And so I was like, yeah, and it's really safe. So I said, okay. So I looked at a flight. I was gonna fly out like the following Tuesday. I remember being so much cheaper and my frugality runs deep. But I was, my gut is telling me I need to fly out today. Like I need to fly out tomorrow. So I think I bought a flight for the next evening and closed my computer, went to lunch. And that's when countries started announcing mandatory quarantine. And now it's so funny. Quarantine, yeah, that's what you have to do. But at the time, that sounded so scary and so dramatic. And how much does it cost? What does it look like? And the cutoff was midnight the following day. So I actually Ubered to the airport and asked the airline if they would allow me to fly to New Zealand that day. I showed them my tickets for the next day. It was wild. They did not charge me extra. They didn't charge me for my luggage, which didn't have any luggage because I had a weekender bag. And they just said, yeah, get on the plane. I later found out that the Malaysian government was instructed to get foreigners out because they knew their infrastructure couldn't handle the pandemic or coronavirus if it was as bad as they intended. And so I was on a plane to New Zealand. My suitcase still to this day is in Bali. I don't think I'll ever see it again. And I arrived to New Zealand like in a sundress. It was like fall going into winter there. And I had a 90-day visa. Long story short, I ended up living there 15 months.
Wow. Wow. My gosh. And you got to do your van life adventure.
I did.
And I remember there were some cold nights and some lonely days, but some
Van
also
life is it's Instagram versus reality. It's not as good as it looks on Instagram. Still incredibly grateful I did it. It was awesome, but man, it was challenging.
yeah, I can imagine. But you also bought your first property remotely, right? That was the first time that sight unseen, you're on the other side of the world. So help people wrap their mind around how that is possible and how do you go about finding a property, feeling
Yeah.
comfortable, putting on payment, all that kind of stuff. How do you do that?
Yeah, so it was 2020 and I owned 2 properties at this point. So that very first house that I bought while I was working for you, which was running as what I call like rent by the room. So these are long-term tenants. They were all on their separate leases. As a side note, we actually joke that's like a magic house because every person that moves into it gets engaged.
Oh,
I think it's
really?
just a theme because it's Kansas and people are in their 20s, but I joke that I saw the theme and I have issues with commitment, so I bought a one-way ticket to Asia. So that house was still running. At this point, it was cash flowing about $700 a month, which for anyone looking to buy real estate now in 2025, like that's great cash flow. And then I bought another duplex 2 years later in 2019. I'm sure you remember this. You and I both came to the conclusion that I wasn't going to work for you. And I was like, okay, but can you not let me go yet? Because I'm under contract on a house. And so I'm pretty sure I closed on the house at like noon and my like last day was like the next day with you,
Yeah.
which
Something like that.
any mortgage company, please don't listen to this. I was not doing anything wrong, but I bought that second property. So in 2020, I owned two properties, a duplex and a single family. But you're exactly right. Those were in Kansas City, a city that I'm familiar with. And it was 2020, and I just wasn't getting the same deal sent to me from agents in Kansas City. And for those of you looking to buy in places that you don't live, a great investor friendly agent is really the way to go. They know the market. A lot of markets like Kansas City are street to street. So one street might be A class, but if you go two streets over, it's C class. So your agents really are key, which might lead to, okay, how the heck do I find an agent? You have Vanessa. So message Vanessa, say, hey, I'm thinking about renting or buying a rental in this market, and she will introduce you to an agent.
Hey, I'm going to cut in here real quick. I'm so glad Sarah brought up our buyer matching referral system. One of the things that we do to help people move abroad is match them with an English speaking local real estate expert. In the show notes, you'll find our buyer matching questionnaire. Fill that out, and we will personally introduce you to an agent in your desired market to help you buy your dream property. And as an added bonus, we'll give you up to $1,000 upon close when you buy a property through one of our agents. So check that out in the show notes. All right, let's get back to the interview.
Life is all about who you know, but especially when you're looking to be a real estate investor. So that's exactly what I did. I found a real estate agent in a few of the cities that I was interested in. And I was writing offers sight unseen, sometimes in cities I had never been to. And a lot of it came down to data. Like, I know it might sound like I'm just this wild free spirit, but Vanessa can tell you I'm actually a little type A,
Just a bit.
very, very overachiever. I just happen to love adventure. And so when it came to my investing, this had to work. And I'm sure that a lot of your listeners are fearful to one, even invest in real estate because there is risk involved in any type of investing, but especially in real estate, there's a lot of uncertainty. And then to take it a step further and to invest afar where you aren't going to be able to feel and touch and see and do all the things that you might do if the property's a few blocks over, there's a lot of fear in that. So how I really mitigate risk is through creating certainty through things that I can't control. So I only invest in markets where the population's going up. That might seem like new information to people that haven't invested, but it's pretty logical. You're only going to make money if your place is rented. Your place is more likely to be rented if the population is increasing. So you want that increasing. Next is I want jobs increasing. So I want the job rate in that town to be going up rather than down because we need our tenants to be employed. Next is wage increase. I won't get into how wages aren't keeping up with inflation, but yet you want to see that on the upward trend. So you want your tenants making more money so that you can charge more money, which brings me to the next one, which is rent rate. I want to see that rents have increased over time in that market. I think of it as my investing neighbors, like the other landlords. I want them charging more so that I can charge more. It's not that I'm a bad landlord and I want to gouge my tenants. The reality is that rent goes up over time because my insurance increases over time. My property taxes increase over time. So rent will naturally increase as well. And then lastly is crime. That's the only one you want going down. Not only do I want my tenants safe, but I also don't want my insurance rates to increase because of violent crime. So those are the metrics that I look at. And lucky for a lot of people, that a lot of cities qualify. And so there's not very many cities in the US that don't hit my metrics, which then leads to, okay, then how do I actually choose? Your price point is going to dictate a lot. If I'm only able to invest 300,000, then that limits the places that I can find a property at 300,000. Next, you have to decide is, are you investing for appreciation? Meaning you're hoping that the value goes up over time. Your tenants are paying down your principal. It creates equity. And now you have an asset. Or are you focused on cash flow? So at the very beginning, I knew that I eventually wanted to either work for myself or not work at all. So cash flow was the only way I was going to do that. If I bought a something in Denver that broke even every month, sure, I may be gaining equity, but equity doesn't pay the bills. And so I needed something that would rent would be so much higher than what I owed every month so that I could actually take money and put it into my pocket. Um, and that's what led to looking at the markets that I'm in. So I invest in Kansas City, Omaha, and Des Moines.
Really
Okay, so these
sexy
are
places. These I
yeah.
love this. I think this is so important. Like these are normal run of the mill places. There's nothing sexy or romantic about any three of those places.
And
So,
we can say that because I grew up in Kansas and
and
you grew
I'm
up in
from Iowa.
Iowa.
Yeah.
And we've quite literally traveled the world and lived abroad. And yeah, I like to say that as a world traveler, I dreamed about owning an Airbnb in Nebraska.
Yeah.
No, of course not. Like, of course I want to own in Portugal and Merida and maybe Austin or Denver, like these Truckee, like all of these cool places in the United States. But what led to me investing in these three markets is not only did all of the metrics make sense, like I could buy a property that would cash flow, but more importantly, I had a real estate agent sending me deals consistently. I can love Columbus, Ohio, which by the way is a great market to invest in. But if I don't have deal flow, then how am I going to buy something? And so that really is what led to me investing in these places. One other thing I think is important to note is these happen to be like a 3 hour triangle for those of you not familiar with the Midwest. And my parents, grandparents, aunts, uncles, everybody kind of lives in this triangle. So when I was living in Brazil and my family would ask me to fly home for Thanksgiving, I was either flying to Kansas City, Des Moines, or Omaha. Now that flight home for Christmas is a tax write off. It's a business expense because I'm actually flying home to view my property. When I get a rental car, because I don't want to drive around with my parents all the time, that rental car is a business expense. And so I think one thing that I think is also really important, if you guys are going to take anything away from today, is even if you just plan on buying one rental property, treat your rental portfolio like a business. I am not emotionally involved with my properties. I'm not like, oh, it's so cute. I must have it. No, I want it to be a great financial decision, not just in the moment, but long term. And then I put on my tax strategy hat and I find ways to create other benefits in addition to the cash flow and the appreciation.
Beautiful. Thank you, Sarah. That was such a great explanation of how to think through this process. So how did you get into the midterm rental and why do you feel like that's such a great sweet spot?
For a lot of people, Airbnbs sound, when you were talking about sound sexy. Of course, I want to own an Airbnb like in Vail, Colorado, right? That would be cool. Then you created a new job for yourself. So I'm sure a lot of your listeners are looking to work less and not more. Maybe they already have a job. I love calling it a job. And so you're not looking for another job. And that really is what owning a short term rental is like. Sure, you can have property management. They will be glad to charge you 25 to 35%. And you're still managing the manager. And I know this from experience. I thought, oh, this is going to solve all of my problems having a property manager. But then they're still emailing you like, hey, what plumber do you want to use? I'm like, I don't know. That's your job. And so I quickly realized that was not for me. So then I started self managing my properties from abroad. Keep in mind, this is like quite literally while I was living in other countries from afar, even in places like there at the time, there was even units that I had never seen that I owned. And so I'm self managing. And one of the things that I actually learned from you was just being an incredible delegator. And so I hired someone brilliant and smart and capable onto my team, had no real estate experience, but think about it, neither did I just a few years earlier. And I taught her everything that I know. And so between my assistant and I, we self manage all 20 units that I own today. And I'm able to do this because we have systems in place and all of the things that I think are really important. But more importantly, it's a mindset. And so I do not recommend self managing for a lot of people because if getting a text about a dishwasher not working is going to send you in a frenzy, please use a manager. But I have also developed this really strong mindset that this is a business. This is not, while it is my dishwasher, I do own it. My business owns that dishwasher. And if the business has reserves, which all of them do, that is just a business expense. And so I no longer cry over dishwashers. At the beginning, I definitely cried over dishwashers, but I also just didn't have very much money at the beginning. And so that would be my other advice for the audience is be sure that you have the money. You don't need to have a ton of money, but it definitely, you need to be in a place where if the furnace goes out in winter and it needs to be replaced today because it's 27 degrees in Kansas, you need to have that money available or at least credit available to pay for that. I think that eliminates a lot of stress. And why I loved furnished rentals is because of increased cash flow. So, one of the reasons that all of my properties have pretty good reserves or money in the savings accounts is because the furnished rental strategy, you can charge more than a long term rental. But I didn't like getting messages like, well, for a 2 night, 3 night stay, they're going to ask you questions. They're going to need something. Then your cleaner's going to get in there 3 days later and something's broken. It's just a lot. It's a lot of contact and a lot of communication. And even though I have an in house property management assistant, it's still a lot of my involvement. So I had big dreams. I wanted to go on an African safari, and I don't want to be answering my phone like out in the Serengeti, nor will I probably even have cell service. I wanted to do a long through hike in Patagonia, and that's 6 days completely off grid. You can't do that if you run an Airbnb. And so I wanted the increased income or rental income, but I didn't want the headache. And that kind of is where the midterm rental strategy came in. So they're still furnished units. They're still listed on Airbnb and a website called furnishedfinder.com, but I only accept guests for 30 days or more. And on average in 2023, my guests stayed 87 nights.
Hmm.
And so what I'd say is that's about 70 days of silence. Not to say that nothing happens, but I'm telling you, so little happens during a 3 month stay. And so somebody still needed to be by the phone, like my assistant, but now I could finally take time off. And so I did hike Patagonia. I took 6 days completely off grid, followed by another trip backed right into it. And so I now can have increased rent more than a long term rental without the headache of a short term rental.
And one thing you haven't touched on yet are some of the changing Airbnb regulations. I went through this.
Mhm.
I own a property in Andorra. I bought it with a tourist license. It was totally fine. It was going to be an Airbnb. We wanted to use it as a vacation property and blah, blah, blah. In contract, the laws change and my tourist license wasn't grandfathered in. So I have to run it for at least 6 months at a time. And
Yep.
thankfully, my realtor made sure that I bought something that would pencil out as a long-term rental. I wasn't gonna be in the red if it couldn't be Airbnb, but the laws are changing. People are cities
Yeah.
are pushing back. So how do midterm rentals fall into the regulation conversation?
Yeah. And I think it's so important that people understand that not only did that affect your bottom line, but I'm sure you and your family, you were probably thinking, oh, it's going to be so cool to block out some dates and get to use this property in Andorra. So, one thing I should mention is that I actually wrote a book about this strategy. It's called 30 Day Stay. And one of the many reasons that I wrote the book is that I saw the writing on the wall. And so in 2019 and 2020, I saw the headache that Airbnbs were causing my fellow investors. So, exactly what I just mentioned. But then also, short term rental regulations in cities are tightening up. They're actually not allowed in Kansas City. You wouldn't think of Kansas City as like a tourist destination. But guess what? Angry homeowners and other investors didn't like that there were short term rentals in their neighborhood. And so these laws are happening all over the world and probably for good reason. I'm not here to say what is right for housing in every municipality. And so, what I think is important is that you understand what is and isn't allowed. For midterm rentals, because it typically means 30 days or more, But in your case, you just mentioned something that needs to be 6 months or more. That's why it's so important that you pay attention to what's happening and what's likely to happen. So I like investing in places that already have the laws in place so that you're not on edge wondering what's going to happen because eventually the laws are going to come everywhere, even in these small towns in Iowa, because a few furnished rentals could ruin it for everyone. So I like investing places where the rules are clear. And then also, like you said, I'm penciling out the scenario. So I'm making sure that if the rules change or if the rules are already in place, this makes sense. So when I invest, I do make sure that the investment makes sense as a long term rental. For your audience, I'd love to give some like numbers to this too. So I bought a 4 unit building in Omaha. So it's a fourplex. And one of the many reasons that I bought it is because it's by a hospital. So I knew my avatar was going to be travel nurses, which are still prevalent today. There's actually 200,000 vacancies for jobs for in travel nursing. Obviously, that number was tripled during COVID. And so there were plenty of travel nurses at that time, but it's still a very prevalent tenant pool for my units because I'm so close to a hospital. It's so close being within a 15, 20-minute drive. So one bedroom, one bath in that fourplex would rent for about $800 as a long term. And as an Airbnb in the summer, I could make anywhere between 1,600 and 2,200. But come winter, I was barely making more than 800. And so at that point, I'm like, I'm working harder, paying for utilities. I furnish this place and I'm making the same as a long term rental. Overall, when it averaged out at the end of the year, I was making more as an Airbnb or a true short term rental. But then when I started only accepting guests for 30 days or more, I was making 1875 a month. The lowest month I had was 1400 and the highest month I had was 22. But on average, month over month, I'm at 1875. And I don't have my vacancy numbers for 2024 yet, but for 2023, my vacancy was 6%. I think I'm close to about 10% for 2024, mostly because I onboarded a new property management. For anyone that's ever delegated too much, sometimes you don't check people's work. So I probably stepped away a little too much. And then also, we did some pretty big and needed renovations. So some of them were sitting vacant for a week because they were getting new flooring, new cabinets, that kind of thing. And for anyone listening, like 6 to 10% vacancy is fantastic, especially when you plan for it. So I was already planning for 10% vacancy across all my units in my entire portfolio. And so when I beat that and I have less, then I'm really covered. And so instead of charging 800 for a long term, I'm able to get 1875 as a midterm rental.
That's massive. More than double the revenue for not a
Mhm.
whole lot more work.
Especially because it's a 4 unit. So 1875, I'm not feeding my family with that, right? But then I have 4 of them. So if all 4 of them are paying 1875, that's $7,500 a month in rental income. My PITI, principal, interest, taxes, and insurance, my monthly payment is $2,010.
You could live in South America on that, on just that one
Yeah,
property.
that one property. And then I bought the building next door. So I actually own 2 fourplexes next door to each other. And that is something I will tell your audience. While I'm so glad I'm in Kansas City, Omaha, and Des Moines, if you can go all in on a market or two markets, what's great is that when one unit has an issue or I have someone inquire and it's already occupied, I say, hey, actually, I have a building next door you can stay in. Then you're only building a team of one cleaner, one handyman, whereas I have to have 3 different teams running in Des Moines, Kansas City, and Omaha. So I definitely would advise people to go all in on one city. And then I love owning the block. I actually own 4 buildings that are next to each other. And it's really nice to just have them all next door to each other.
Brilliant. What are your plans for the future? What's next for you?
Yeah. So one of the many reasons I moved back to Kansas City is I want to buy a lot of real estate here. And while I love long distance investing and I will always like shout for the mountaintops how it completely changed my life, I also know it's going to be easier if I'm here on the ground. So actually, just yesterday, I walked a flip that I'll be doing with a partner that came on the market the day before. I am even just when I'm driving around, I'm like, oh, that person's grass is overgrown. I'm going to write them a letter. Oh, that looks like an abandoned house. I'm going to find out who owns it, look up the tax records. And so I know that being on the ground, I'm going to buy more real estate. And one of the many reasons I want to buy more real estate is I'm making more money and I need the tax benefits. And so one of the many things that I've really gone all in on is tax strategy. And so figuring out like what do I need to purchase not only for cash flow and now appreciation, but also how can I lighten my tax burden? And with the power of things like the short-term rental loophole and depreciation and cost segregation, which this is all like PhD level investing, I like to joke. But I think that this is really how to build wealth. And when I go back to 2016 and I was working with those wealthy agents, I was envious of their lives, right? Like they had a lot of things that I wanted. I'll never forget one of our clients was going to Lisbon and he's like, "You've been to Lisbon." He's like, "What should I do?" And all the activities that I did made sense. Oh, you got to go down to the south of Portugal and do sea kayaking. You should go to a winery, but then he was like, "Where did you stay?" And I laughed. I'm like, "Listen, Joe, you're not going to want to stay where I was staying. Our budgets are a little different." And so I think that really where I'd like to go from here is I just want to up my lifestyle. Like I love the freedom that I have and I love the things that I get to be able to do. And now I would like to bring more people with me. I'd like to take my parents on more trips. Eventually I want to pay off their mortgage. And I'd like to stay in nicer hotels.
You've always been a girl who likes a nice hotel. Like, you can go real low budget, but you definitely prefer the finer things in life. So I'm excited to see you achieve that. Sarah, one thing I want to talk about right before we wrap up are resources. So you mentioned your book, which is a fantastic resource for people who want to explore midterm rentals. What are some other places people could go to get more information if they want to start investing in real estate?
Yeah, I think one of the things I'd like to see is I'd like to see people choose one book or one strategy. Don't try and go read all five books in a series, listen to 1,000 podcasts. I find that a lot of investors are using education as a way to procrastinate. And so instead, I really encourage you guys to it doesn't have to be my book by any means. There's great books. I do recommend really any book that's published by Bigger Pockets. It's my publisher. The reason I publish with them is they really are the number one resource for real estate investing. They have numerous podcasts, like incredible forum that you can ask questions on. But really the way that I built my portfolio so quickly is in 2020, I owned 3 units. That year, I bought an additional 12 units. And then since then, I've bought an additional, gosh, what is it, like 6 units since then. So I now own 20 units. I really could be completely financially free. My cash flow, pure profit from my rental covers all of my expenses and more. And I did that more or less, I did it in 6 years. And and I can say very happily that I loved working for you and I wasn't making six figures. And
Oh,
so there's probably a lot of your listeners that have good salaries and so they can do it even faster. And so, really, the way that I built my portfolio so quickly is I found a mentor. And I did pay for it. I encourage you guys to do the same thing. I think when you're paying for someone's time, they're giving you their full attention. And so, find somebody that's already done what you want to do and just copy them. The great thing about real estate investing is we're not reinventing the wheel. We're not doing anything really all that special. I'm just doing what other investors have successfully done.
brilliant. Sarah, thank you so much. It was so exciting to reconnect with you and I'm so proud of everything that you've accomplished. I'm so glad I was part of the early part of your journey. I'll include all of the resources we talked about in the show notes for people to follow up with you and learn more about what you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you for everything. I really wouldn't be where I am today had I not worked for you and
Aw.
just learned all of these amazing things about how to be a great communicator and a great delegator. And I'm eternally grateful to you.
If you are dreaming of a life filled with travel, freedom, and financial independence, real estate can be the key to making that happen. Complete our buyer matching questionnaire, and we'll connect you to a local real estate expert to help you start the process. And don't forget, we'll give you up to $1,000 back at closing when you work with one of our referral partners. I hope you found this interview inspiring and insightful. Follow up with Sarah, check out the resources that she has available, get her book, 30 Day Stay. I hope that you're feeling inspired to take that first step forward to financial freedom and global living. If you've enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe and share. And until next time, happy travels and happy investing.